Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It is 11 o'clock Eastern time here in the Washington, D.C. area on February 23rd, 2021. And the date is important because I'm here to welcome you to the first in a series of 20th anniversary events for public knowledge. So thank you for joining us. This is a pleasure for me actually to host this one because PK is a special institution, and we're going to be celebrating our 20th anniversary all year long with a series of topics to talk about PK's past, some of the big fights and issues we've worked on, and also where we're going in the future. So I hope you'll enjoy this first Public Knowledge 20th anniversary webinar event because we're going to focus today on the founding of public knowledge. And so to help us with that, I wanted to start out actually with a video before we introduce our special guest panel. So if we could ask the team to play the video and get a taste of why and how public knowledge was started.
Hi, my name is Gigi Sohn.
Greetings, my friends at Public Knowledge. I'm David Bollier.
In 2001, I, along with my friends David Bollier and Laurie Racine, founded Public Knowledge.
20 years ago, we thought we were on the vanguard of the future.
The reason Public Knowledge was founded was because in the late 90s, a couple of laws were passed that gave public interest advocates, academics, and philanthropies great concern that information was starting to be privatized, that it was no longer part of the commons, but basically being put behind paywalls. And those two laws, two of the laws anyway, that gave people concern were the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, which extended copyright terms by 20 years, and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which among other things made illegal the breaking of digital locks or digital rights management for any particular reason. In addition, there was growing concern, and this from industry as well, that internet access providers were becoming gatekeepers to the internet and that they might favor certain content services. And at the time, that issue was called open access. It is now called net neutrality, which everybody is familiar with.
But even in our state of digital primitivism, we saw how copyright law was out of control, curbing our political and cultural and civic freedoms. We saw how the DMCA and international treaties were trying to create a world of total control. We knew that there was no dedicated voice for digital users and the public in Washington, D.C., and we saw a Washington bubble dominated by big tech protectionists or locked in the time warp, or both.
And now, Public Knowledge's issues have broadened to include privacy, antitrust, other kinds of technology policy, Section 230, and content moderation, but it still remains true to its core, and that is access to information and making sure that consumer interests are supported and looked at by the government.
Yes, thank you indeed to our three founders who are all joining us today as our special guest panelists. In order, let me introduce to you first the two who are on the video. Our first executive director and president CEO, Gigi Sohn, who's now the distinguished fellow at Georgetown's Law Institute for Tech Policy, and also a senior fellow at the Benton Foundation. She was joined in that video by David Bollier, who's now the director for Reinventing the Commons program at Schumacher Center for New Economics. And also joining us is their partner in crime in starting Public Knowledge, Laurie Racine, who is currently the president of Racine Strategies. Thank you all for being here today, and also thank you for what you did creating Public Knowledge 20 years ago, and on behalf of all of us who have inherited this great institution and the great work that we get to do. What I'd like to do is actually turn to you, Laurie. We weren't able to put together in time to add you to that video, but I hope you could start us off by taking us back to 2001. And what were the component parts that allowed us or allowed you all to create public knowledge as an institution? Oh, and I'll have to ask you to unmute.
Hi, welcome everybody, and thanks. This feels a little bit like we're in Brewster Kahl's Wayback Machine, where we're taking a look back at something that we were all very, very passionate about and still are. The seeds of public knowledge, I think, emanate from a company called Red Hat, which had the largest IPO of 1999 and was a leader in open source technology. The founders of Red Hat were prescient enough to realize that their newfound wealth could lead them to flip open source from a technology into a philosophy. And I was fortunate enough to run that endeavor for them for a number of years. And what that allowed us to do was to look at where this idea of open collaboration and open source, not as a business model, but again, as a philosophy, could begin to have impact on policy, the founding of for-profits, not-for-profits, and seeding of academic programs and services in ways that hadn't been done before. Gigi and David and I met. Gigi was at the Ford Foundation, and David and I met Gigi, or maybe they knew each other. I can't even remember. We've been together for so long. But we met and we started talking about what would it look like, as David suggests in the video, to create an entity in Washington, D.C. that could represent consumers in the digital age, because this was not being done before. And also at the same time drive not only a series of initiatives and policy, but also make consumers aware of what was going on in Washington, D.C., and then also have some reflection into what was going on in the marketplaces with startups and with foundations, et cetera, that were embracing this idea of open, and at the same time, how to get a more expansive look at copyright, how to embrace what was about to happen in the future, and essentially be a little bit prescient about it as well.
And David, what were you doing in 2001 when you paired up?
I had was working then for Norman Lear, the TV producer, as a general strategist and collaborator on non-television projects. But Gigi and I had worked on a number of broadcast public interest projects, including an advisory panel on the future of public interest in broadcasting, chaired by Les Moonves at the time. So we sort of knew each other and were traveling in these circles. And it was fortuitous that the three of us sort of had these discussions, because we each brought something different to the table. And we all shared, however, the conviction that there was not a focused, dedicated advocate for digital users in the digital age. And here we were on the cusp of a proprietary industrial 20th century world moving into an open network. And we take for granted the open network today, but this was seen as, and correctly seen, as a huge liberation for all sorts of interests. And we wanted to push that as far as we could. So that was really where my head was at, and I think Gigi's and Laurie's as well.
Chris, if I could just add, the context here was, as I said in the video, two major laws were passed in the copyright space, right? In the digital copyright space, right? It was the extension of copyright terms to 75 years beyond the life of an author. And then the DMCA, which originally didn't pass in the US, but what happened was the copyright industries went overseas, got the WIPO treaty, and then came back to the States and said, oh, look what we signed. Look what you guys signed overseas. Now you have to pass a law. And while there was some opposition to it, led by the libraries, very gamely, we got rolled. Okay, people that, thought both of these laws were dangerous for innovation, dangerous for creativity, just got steamrolled. And I think that was one of the reasons. So when I was at the Ford Foundation, I convened a meeting, I think in 2000, with Laurie was there. David, I don't know if you were there, but Larry Lessig, Yochai Benkler, Julie Cohen, Pam Samuelson. It was really like all-star panel. And it was pretty clear. And some of these folks had worked with the coalition fighting the DMCA and the Copyright Term Extension Act. And they said, we need a regular presence in Washington, D.C. Like EFF was on the left coast doing great work, but there's only so much you can do when things are happening on Capitol Hill, in the agencies every single day.
So you're really describing well the gap in the field that you filled by creating public knowledge. Gigi, how did you get anointed to be the executive director?
Well,
It's obvious.
I think Laurie anointed me. So I was at the Ford Foundation, where I set up what is now the biggest funding program for media, communications, technology policy. But I was not given the permanent job, which everything worked out. I have no regrets. And Laurie came to me and said, "We need to start this organization. I'll pay you to be a consultant." And then she, what became the Center for the Public Domain, which originally the Red Hat Foundation, funded the first 2 years of public knowledge, and I just basically filled in the rest. So I got appointed and anointed by Laurie.
I thought it was a lifetime appointment. I didn't realize she was going to go on to do this amazing.
If only it was a lifetime appointment.
Really?
No, she's doing fantastic
And
work.
could I just earmark the fact that there was some venture funds for exploring this in a way that hadn't been done, because there was a fair amount of education we had to do with the philanthropic community, because this was really a novel frontier. And I think Laurie was kind of a free radical in that space who was able to move it forward as a peer with many in the philanthropy world. So I thought, that was a really important contribution here.
So Gigi, in those early years, what would you describe as kind of the secret sauce for public knowledge being able to continue? A lot of nonprofits start and they don't continue. So what do you think went well, and what was the political atmosphere like for us in the field and across the sector?
First of all, the timing couldn't have been better. 2000, well, in some ways timing could have been worse. I opened the doors of public knowledge over teaism in DuPont Circles, free space given to me by the New America Foundation, by Steve Clemens, and unfortunately the late Ted Halstead, who were the head of New America Foundation, that's what it was called at the time, gave me free space over teaism. And we opened the doors on August 17th, 2001. So 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, everything, obviously 9/11 just stopped everything. So that was bad timing, although it did give me time to kind of ramp things up. But it was great timing to the extent that I think almost every month there was a new bill where the large copyright holders were trying to get either technology manufacturers or ISPs or somebody to protect their copyright, right? Mandates to essentially be the copyright police. So who are you going to call? Who's going to come and testify? And by the way, I got beat up. I got beat up by both parties. Let's put it that way. My biggest nemesis, who eventually became my friend, was Howard Berman, a Democratic congressman from Southern California. No surprise that Southern Californians were pretty big into strong copyright. Although Howard admitted to me later on that he thought that his vote to extend copyright terms another 20 years was a mistake. So we had this sort of mutual admiration society. So the timing was perfect. People were looking for a consumer advocate to sort of take the other side. The other thing that I think was secret to our success was that we would form alliances with anybody, right? So sometimes we'd be on the side of the ISPs, sometimes we'd be against them. On copyright, we were on the same side. When we got to do more telecom, obviously we're on opposite side. We would work with Republicans. One of my favorite stories was when I used to meet with the Republican conference all the time, led by Mike O'Reilly, who became an FCC commissioner, who was working for Senator John Sununu at the time. We would meet at Charlie Palmer's Steakhouse, and we would do strategy sessions around digital copyright issues. So I think it was the willingness to work with everybody, nonpartisan, and the fact that these issues were so hot. And then by year 2 or 3, well, even in year 1 and 2, folks were starting to get concerned about the power of the ISPs, which were narrowband at the time. They weren't even broadband at the time. And companies like Disney and Microsoft and others, were pushing something, as I said in the video, called open access. And that again morphed into net neutrality. So while I'd say the first 2-3 years of work were almost entirely focused on copyright, the telecom stuff, which has always been my bailiwick, was not far behind.
Here's the other thing, though, I think that it's important to remember that that public knowledge serves an educative role in Washington, that Congress and the Senate had really very little understanding where the internet was going. They had no vision for the future of it. And that a lot of what the early, I think, work of public knowledge was Gigi literally explaining. And I'm not saying dumbing it down, but I am saying simplifying the issues that were looming, that they weren't paying attention to, and that were going to occur as we moved through the acceleration of the internet.
Yeah, I mean, it's always, as you know, Chris, because I hired you, communications and being able to explain this stuff simply to me was as important as any filing we did at the FCC or FTC or in Congress. So to actually, go door to door to policymakers and with a one pager that simply explains it, particularly at a time where the technology was so nascent and there wasn't a lot of, or any, frankly, technology expertise, particularly on the Hill. I think to be able to dumb it down, I'm sorry, Laurie, I'll say it, and talk about, okay, this is the interest of your constituents. Okay, this is not an industry battle. This is something that actually affects your constituents. I think was a really important role that we played.
And here's one other thing, and then I'll stop, is that the things that were happening in 2001 from the market perspective, and I think I threw this over, but I'm going to bring it up again, is the iPod launched. Yes. Apple opened what they considered to be the jukebox of all time, which was the iTunes store. Windows XP launched, Windows Explorer launched, 6.0, the Xbox launched. Nokia and Ericsson, who I don't even know if they're still in business, were the market leaders in cell phones and making these interesting kind of advances that people were overwhelmed with. Were so rudimentary, like a colored screen. And I think that those, and then here's the other thing. Google launched image search, BitTorrent launched, and Wikipedia launched. Game changers, right, on the internet. And I think that having policy be drive, or at least follow on to what was happening much more rapidly across the digital spectrum was incredible. And Larry Lessig was suing Microsoft for antitrust violation.
Yeah, Laurie, I have to say, the point you guys made about, your concern about how technology was developing, and you were keenly aware of how it was developing and the concerns that we should have into the future as innovation happens, to me is really important. It's what I loved about public knowledge when you hired me, Gigi, because we didn't just fight the fights in front of us, but we were thinking ahead. I know in my first year, we put together principles for the tech transition. That was happening and is still happening. But you were already doing 3D printing symposiums, which was a technology that no one in Congress had really seen before on a consumer level. So being able to be forward-looking, I think, is something we've tried to continue on as a legacy from your guys' work early on. David, you wanted to add more?
I was going to say I just wanted to punch out the topic of law scholars as being at the time in the vanguard of interpreting a lot of this. And I remember a really watershed conference by the Conference on the Public Domain in November of 2001, and it was kind of a electric gathering of vanguard legal scholars trying to make sense of these really dizzying developments. Lessig had not, or maybe had just barely published his book Code. Benkler hadn't published Wealth of the Networks yet. And there were a series of other treatises that had not really reached out, but this was kind of trying to desperately make sense of some very confusing developments. And I think public knowledge helped popularize and be the walk it across the street to Congress to help give it more operational reality.
I want to remind the audience, we're going to go for an hour here and we're already 20 minutes in. So in a few minutes, we are going to open it up. We have a couple questions coming in, but please feel free to write questions into the Q&A, and I'll relay them to our expert panel here. But before we do that, let's talk a bit more. it was really interesting hearing you guys talk about the technology of that era. And Laurie, you named some names that some younger folks may not know, which is just how technology has developed. Can you talk a bit or reflect a bit, all of you, on the mood around technology back then? Because I recall, and I was coming out of college, it felt like a real period of techno optimism. The openness that you were describing that you wanted to preserve made people feel like there were all sorts of possibilities. And now we see a lot of criticism of technology. So is that an accurate description? And how do you view how that mood has shifted? Any of you?
So I'll start. Look, I came from working for Andy Schwartzman, trying to get cable operators and broadcasters to serve the public interest. And it was a complete and total failure. Not because Andy and I weren't good lawyers. It's just, it's not the nature. Those were command and control, top-down media. When Rush Limbaugh passed last week, it reminded me of an op-ed duel I had with him on the fairness doctrine in electronic media. That was the magazine. It is not online. I tried to find it. But you were battling over scraps. So when this technology comes along that would allow anybody with a connection to speak, you're like, we can. It used to take us an assistant, 2 days to organize a meeting. Now you could just press a button and all of a sudden, you have 20 people in a meeting. I mean, there were great reasons for optimism, and not just from a freedom of expression perspective, but from a perspective of a small nonprofit, fighting some of the biggest multinational corporations in the world. So yeah, there was good reason for it. I still think there's good reason for it. Look, I mean, were we starry-eyed? I don't know about that. I mean, I think people also forget, or they conveniently forget, that when both Democrats and Republicans were allowing big tech companies to consolidate, we were fighting it. So when the Federal Trade Commission early in the Obama years were investigating Apple and Google and Facebook for some of their actions around competition in the platform space, I met with John Leibowitz, who was the chair at the time. I met with several of the commissioners. We were on the right side. So I think our principles, I think the public knowledge's principles have maintained throughout. But, sometimes if you don't win some of those battles, then you have the situation that we have today. So I wouldn't say that we were, too starry-eyed about the internet. I think we're in the right place, but sometimes stuff happens that despite your best efforts are outside your control.
I also think people were working in silos. Right. In other words, as David suggests, right, what was happening in academia, what was happening in Washington, what was happening for the consumer, there was no intersection there. And I think one of the kind of quiet roles that public knowledge played was to be that intersection, to be that group of people that could communicate things. And I know I'm harping on that, but that's largely what it's about. It's, it's in many ways, it's marketing, it's telling the story. And making sure that there was these cross conversations going on among groups that weren't necessarily talking to each other, even on the right side of the issue.
I think there was also maybe a sense that certain corporate platforms would be more benign than they turned out to be. I think that openness was seen as the panacea, and we've seen that they can be enclosed. I mean, a lot of my attention since in the past 20 years has shifted to the idea of a commons as a social system. And we've seen how, as opposed to simply an unowned resource, and we've seen how social systems can be outmaneuvered and captured the way open source has often been neutralized or captured, the way a lot of social media have been captured, and the so-called sharing economy is just the micro rental economy. It's not the sharing economy, and so forth. So I think that we've developmentally grown up a lot in the past 20 years that we couldn't really have anticipated as thoroughly.
So Gigi, as the executive director in those early years, was there a victory that really stood out to you that you thought was really important or really really set the tone for the organization and its path forward. I can't help but remember my mentor and friend who introduced me to you, Tom Wheeler, said, well, you want to go work for Gigi at Public Knowledge, public interests, they don't always win, they don't have all the lobbyists, they don't have all the money. But there must have been some that you're really proud of.
Oh yeah. Well, look, there's one substantive and then one, one personnel, one institutional. The substantive was when we won the broadcast flag case. So just to remind people, this was 2005, so early years. And the FCC really very cynically, Michael Powell is a friend of mine. But when he was chair, his FCC adopted a rule that required digital broadcasters to embed a series of code in their signals that would not permit you to send even portions, like if you appeared on the news, you would be able to send that over the internet to your family, okay? And no industry people, despite my begging, were willing to sue the FCC. So we basically paid a law firm a boatload of money, which we got back because we won royally, to bring the case against the FCC. And we won 3-0 with one or two conservatives on the court. But it was about FCC authority and whether they had the right to tell TV manufacturers to obey that digital signal. And they said, no, they did not. And what was really fascinating about that case was our high-priced lawyers didn't make a good enough case about standing in the first instance. So the judges gave us a second bite at the apple to prove standing. And I said, they want us to win, right? Because otherwise they'd be like, out the door out, courthouse door closed. But they gave us a second bite at the apple. We proved standing thanks to the Library Association. And the name of the case is ALA versus FCC. We put the librarians first for a reason. And we won the case, first front page of the New York Times. And I think it was, it was really, really important for us, even though ALA was at the top, and we had to explain to people this was the case that Public Knowledge generated. But that was a huge win. The institutional win, there's been a lot of institutional wins, and I hope we do talk about, building an institution, because that's really what I'm most proud of. I'm so proud of you. Like, I'm proud of my hires now doing fantastic things with this organization. But I think our first big institutional win was hiring Ernesto Falcone to be our first lobbyist.
Yes.
And we've had a lot of great folks, including Harold, obviously, and we had Mike Godwin. We've had, and Bartiz Strange, my Bartiz is now
look him up on
he just did a Tiny Desk concert for NPR. He was on Seth Meyers' show. I mean, I gave that guy his first job. You know how proud I am? I'm like a proud mama here. Anyway, hiring Ernie really took us to another level, I think. That wasn't the earliest years. It was sort of mid-years, but I think that was huge for us.
No, we definitely discussed that as a staff. The shift from what I understand, and tell me if it's wrong, was really more like a small boutique law firm to when you brought on Ernie, expanding into thinking how we communicate to the broader public and also kicking our advocacy into a higher gear. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And then we added a bunch of other folks, fantastic, Clarissa Ramon, Martin Griffin, yourself, Ortiz. I mean, a lot of people talk the talk about diversity, and that's the other thing I'm really, really proud of. We had at one point a third of our staff were diverse. And it just gave me great joy because I just loved every single one of them, and they made the organization better. So building an actual institution that survives me now by 8 years is a huge source of pride for me.
Wonderful. So Laurie and David, as you look at the issues, again, as the institution has grown and developed, are there any that you're most interested in? Or is it really the core, access to information issues that you're still following the most?
Well,
I love that you asked that question.
Laurie, you go first.
I have, Gigi and I have discussed, for me, the issue of high-speed internet bandwidth and connectivity in general that we have failed, I think, so miserably at making a reality in this country. And again, let's just go back 1 second. When we started in 2001, Clinton was busy laying fiber optic cable and kind of chasing us. Bob Young and I had several meetings with them as they were trying to figure out, well, how do we get this to happen, and how do we make it happen for the country? And then it just didn't. So this idea that there's this uneven access affects education, climate, and healthcare in ways that now become so critical to basically making internet access a public utility. For me, there's nothing else, right? It's all about education, healthcare, and climate. And the thing that is the foundation of that is being able to get high-speed internet connectivity. And we've no policy about it. We have no way to essentially scale it, and nobody's paying us for it, from my perspective, enough attention to it.
A lot of my attention in the past 20 years has focused from trying to use policy to enable user communities and self-governance to arise. So it's less policy driven than empowering the open source community, the wiki community, the open design community. There's even a Cosmo local production where there's a lot of shared design internationally, but locally produced. And I think a lot of these have some profound implications for reinventing the economy in new ways and disrupting some of the top-down corporate dominance of supply systems. But policy hasn't necessarily kept up with that. And I think that's why some of those bedrock ideas like net neutrality and getting beyond some of the artificial restrictions of copyright and trademark are so important. And so I think public knowledge, by playing the Washington insider game as an advocate for a lot of the on-the-ground users, is an important synapse or connection that needs to be maintained as very strong, because otherwise, we lose a whole lot democratically, civically, creatively.
Great, thank you, David. Reminder to folks who are watching, if you're joining us on Zoom as opposed to the YouTube live stream, you can put questions into the Q&A box and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. I've got a few more of my own, but I do want to turn to some of the topics that are coming in over the Q&A, so keep them coming. There's a number of comments or questions here about the issue that is run through, it seems like, the entire history of public knowledge, and that's net neutrality. So let's talk a little bit about net neutrality. First of all, Gigi, you described in the video how it was described as open access. And one person asked the difference between, or is there a difference between old open access and what we think of as net neutrality now?
Yeah, there is actually. I also wanted to say, because I saw that John Winhausen, who's the head of the Shelby Coalition, is asked one of the questions. And John actually wrote the first paper, I don't know if you remember, John, for public knowledge about net neutrality. So open access was more about the requirement that dominant ISPs open up their networks to all comers. And then it kind of, in 2002, when the FCC reclassified broadband as an information service, that requirement went away. So that was actually part of the wonderful Telecommunications Act of 1986, which John Winhausen also worked on. And when that went away, then, the whole competitive ISP model just vanished. It just shrunk. Well, it didn't shrink, it just went away. So then it became, okay, how do we require the companies that are left that have this gatekeeper power, how do we require them to keep their networks open? And that's where we came to net neutrality. Again, open access has kind of come back again, because you have a lot of communities building middle mile networks, and they say, okay, last mile folks, come one, come all, and provide service to our constituents. So open access is making a comeback, not as a requirement, but as a preferred model for a lot of communities across the US. And maybe if we're good enough advocates, it will come back as a preferred model for funding in rural areas as well.
I don't know if people still do this, but also at the beginning of Open Knowledge, there was a lot of talk, and I think this was, Gigi and David, correct me if I'm wrong, it was written either by Benkler or Tim Wu, this whole idea of how the internet is constructed from at the top, the content, is under content application, under application is code, and below that are the pipes. And that, this whole idea of keeping, in order for content to work, the pipes have to be open, right? And dumb pipes. And that was I think, a beautiful explication of the internet in those days. I don't know if people still think about it that way. It may just be taken for granted and the whole thing gets smushed together. It's curious to me, and I'm actually flipping this back on you, Chris. Do people still think about the internet in terms of it being layered, or is that something that is not happening anymore? Because it really helps to understand where the issues are.
Yeah, some of us do, but there's, some in industry, there's a benefit to them to kind of making the internet one thing, right? So when you want to reinstate net neutrality, they say, well, you can't regulate the internet, right? And we have to constantly explain over and over. No, we're not talking about regulating the content, applications, and services that ride on the pipes. We're talking about regulating the on-ramp, the pipe. So you have to constantly, again, it depends on who you're talking to. There's either a benefit in mushing it all together or there's not.
It reminds me of a recent paper that Cory Doctorow produced, which is really back to the future, in which he said, let's have protocols instead of regulating platforms, because get the end-to-end principle reestablished instead of having the big tech players dominate so much of the space and really interrupt the end-to-end flow and competition and innovation and all the rest that flows from that. And so I think we're kind of stuck in this snarl where we don't have the open protocols that maybe at the dawn of the internet we had. And how do we find a way back to that Garden of Eden?
Yeah, that's exactly right, David. I think Public Knowledge could produce a series of T-shirts that basically, the internet, CALP, or whatever it is,
No, we love a good T-shirt.
Protocol pipes, right? CAP.
No, I have to say, one of the commonly heard things that I hear in congressional hearings or from members of Congress is that, this is confusing, and you say you want an open internet, you don't want blocking or throttling, but what about when it happens with this company, and they'll name a dominant digital platform, and it is served, I think, to confuse the issue sometimes. Not that there isn't a problem with dominance of dominant digital platforms, which a lot of us are actively discussing right now, but the idea that the consumer doesn't know the difference between a web service or a website and the people they're paying every month for internet access just always seemed like a dumb argument to me.
Well, but that's part of what happens in an evolution, right? In other words, you begin to take things for granted, and I think that's where we are. It's like turning on a light bulb. We assume we're going to get it. We don't really care how it happens, but then we forget to kind of dig deeper and figure out, well, in order to change the future, we have to understand how it was architected.
Sort of like we thought that anonymity was the end goal to which we should aspire, and now we see that authenticated digital identity is perhaps more important.
Oh yes. So
powerful,
one more in net neutrality, because someone did ask. They described it as a wonky niche issue, and certainly there are folks who don't really understand what it means. But I feel like over time, Public Knowledge has had a big role in helping people understand it and make it a wildly popular issue, if you look at the polling at least. Gigi, how did you go about taking something that was technical in nature and making it wildly popular?
Can I just say wonky niche issue? I used to get, when I was at the FCC, I used to get phone calls at 11 o'clock at night from my chief of staff, Ruth Milkman, saying, make the emails stop, because we were getting flooded with thousands, like 24 of us in the agency. We're getting flooded with emails saying Title II net neutrality. So it stopped being wonky niche issue just about when I left, I would say. I'm not sure it's that anymore. I think the way you get from wonky niche to popular is by showing real examples of how it would impact people. And again, this is about building coalitions. And you know, Chris, I'm constantly beating the drum about the need to build a broad-based coalition, including some of the healthcare providers, environmentalists for universal broadband. And I think we did this with net neutrality. And it used to be, again, a left-right coalition. I remember we had Gun Owners of America, and we had the Christian Coalition. I mean, we had a whole wide spectrum of folks. I think when you actually give examples, and there were actual examples at the time, the most famous one, obviously, of Comcast blocking the uploads of barbershop quartets and the King James Bible. When you give real life examples of how the internet could be manipulated, internet traffic could be manipulated that way, people are like, oh, you know, and look, this was a time when net neutrality was starting to become part of the public lexicon. It was a time when people were starting their own little businesses, right? I remember the chocolatier in New Mexico and the bookseller in Iowa. And you say, oh, well, what if Barnes and Noble, which was a bookstore at the time, got faster, kind of Amazon wasn't barely a blip at the time, was able to pay for faster speeds than you, then what would happen? Oh, gee, now I see. So you have to kind of give examples so people can visualize why this is important. And that's, I think, how you get to more of a popular cause celeb. But it was interesting because I remember when I was at the FCC, I was told that there were more calls about restoring net neutrality or putting in place net neutrality to the Hill at the time than there was on healthcare. So it went from wonky to popular pretty quickly. And I think that's because people were able to understand what it meant to them personally.
Yeah. You still think that's true?
I hope so. I mean, what do you guys think?
Well, it's certainly true with regard to broadband access, right? I mean, everybody hates the pandemic, but if the pandemic has done one thing, in fact, some of us and some people who are in the audience here just saw a presentation of polling the numbers for having government do more to get access to people, to access broadband access to everybody is off the charts. Mm-hmm. So it's sad that it had to take a tragedy like this for it to happen. I don't think net neutrality is quite there, but again, and that's why I think it's important to tie the need for the FCC to have oversight authority, right? Whether it be Title II or whether Congress passes a Title VII or a Title X or what have you, to getting broadband for everybody.
I think one of the goals of CC coming up, Chris, and then I'll shut up, sorry, is that this idea of the work of public knowledge being better understood outside of the Beltway, mm-hmm. Making public knowledge a household name, right? In other words, so people turn to the idea of the work of public knowledge and it rolls off their tongue because they know it, they understand it, and it's something that they realize is happening in Washington, D.C. that affects their daily lives. That, for me, would be a goal for the next 2 or 3 years of public knowledge. I think it's almost an imperative.
From your mouth to God's ears, Laurie. We'll see if we can make that happen. David, were you trying to get...
Well, I was just going to say, I think that the net neutrality as the focus of anti-competitive dominance has shifted to other arenas. So maybe it's not quite as urgent or as top of mind, but there's all sorts of ways that the big tech players have used different vehicles for asserting their dominance in the marketplace. And I think, attention has understandably shifted to those other ways. So, antitrust chief among them.
So we actually do have a question here from someone who wanted your guys' views or thoughts on Shoshana Zuboff's famous thesis about the age of surveillance capital, that big internet companies and when she says that, I think she means the tech platforms and not the ISPs, have pushed towards a lawless environment where they can flourish without constraints. This is the hot debate, as you said, David, right now in Washington. Public Knowledge is testifying this Thursday in a House Antitrust Committee hearing on the topic of digital platforms as gatekeepers. Are you guys following this, and what do you think of that conversation?
I'll leave others to talk about that on an expert way, but a lot of my attention is focused on developing user-based alternatives. I think, like, for example, platform cooperatives as a vehicle that can provide collective action without being hostage to some of the platform providers is one way to sort of, without necessarily having a policy-driven approach, create alternatives. But I think obviously we need that antitrust enforcement, and that has to catch up to the contemporary realities.
It sounds a little bit like the concept of interoperability that we've been pushing, that you can have choice or move between different platforms. Is that what you mean by?
Yeah, I think that it's that, but I think it's not just a policy-driven thing. I think there's needs for legal recognition of these peer-created communities, new forms of finance, whether it's self-finance or external finance, for platform cooperatives, for example, to get going, for different types of productive networks to be able to support themselves, so that it's not simply the dominant corporate players morphing into the new space and controlling it from the start. So, this is not directly policy driven, even though, of course, strong antitrust action is a necessary prerequisite for those user communities to flourish.
So look, I think you guys are in the absolute right direction, calling for an agency to oversee the online platforms. I mean, we cannot have the situation we have now, which is, for all intents and purposes, they're not regulated. I mean, if we have an entity that hopefully soon will be regulating broadband companies again, we've got to have an oversight entity that looks at privacy, that looks at competition policy beyond antitrust. Obviously, antitrust law is broken. We know that. I'm sure Charlotte is going to testify to that effect, and that needs to be fixed. But as Gene Kimmelman has said many times, and as Harold has said many times, it's not enough. These companies are too important to the economy to just be left to the vagaries of the marketplace. I know they're popular, but as you know, I'm a believer that, with the right touch regulation, everybody can benefit, both the companies and the public. But it's long past time for them to be just basically free of any government oversight, other than for things like taxes and other things that every other company has oversight in. So and Tom Wheeler has also pushed this, and I'd love to see some heroes on the Hill really take this seriously and start the conversation, kind of like the way Elizabeth Warren started the conversation on the CFPB. Start the conversation about whether they ought to be a digital, I don't know, it's called the Digital Platform Authority or something like that.
That's what we called it, but call it what you want.
It may be a 5 or 10, even a 10-year process, but I think starting to get some legislative proposals now, it's absolutely necessary. And I don't think it spells the death of these companies. They're still going to be powerful. They're still going to be the major players. But you have a regulatory scheme. You have the promotion of competition to allow in some of the players that David's talking about. And then maybe hopefully you have a more fervent, a more fruitful and a more competitive environment.
I also think it would be helpful to for the public knowledge to begin to articulate some of the options. What does that look like when we talk about regulation? Because I think what happens is people just shut down. They don't really understand, and this is a communications issue. They don't really understand the intricacies of it. And even as just to be provocative as to what some of the tenets of that regulation might look like, that's another role public knowledge could play.
Great point, Laurie. And we'll be promoting a couple major proposals in the testimony on Thursday. So you can tell us if we did a good job of explaining it in a plain and simple way, like is the tradition. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. There's a couple questions here coming in for more stories and more talk about how public knowledge does its work. So one asks us about the partnerships, the strange bedfellows that materialize around policy, and are there any stories that you guys have to share? I probably think of you, Gigi, since you were executive director, about ones that were fruitful that people wouldn't expect.
Yeah, I mean, I remember testifying. Well, first of all, I was asked several times by John McCain to testify on video competition issues. That's another
Yes.
place really where
Yeah.
nobody else is really doing the same kind of work around competition in the cable space, in the video space, if you guys are looking for more to do, and I don't think you need more to do, there's issues around streaming that you might want to look at as well. But I remember, being on panels with, folks from the Karen Kerrigan, I forget, it's a Small Business Alliance, whatever, and other, maybe even Grover Norquist's group, right? So, every once in a while, you can find these issues that just don't cut neatly across lines. So the video issues, the copyright issues, definitely. I talked about the Charlie Palmer Steakhouse lunches. Those were the days. Don't have those anymore. So yeah, and I've always loved those. I love my public interest colleagues, right? And I loved them when I was at Public Knowledge. But there's something about joining with folks that, you probably don't agree with anything else on, and working towards common cause and just respecting each other. That is an art that I think Public Knowledge has practiced for a really long time. And it's very, very satisfying. And I'll tell you, not everybody appreciates it. I was told by some of our friends that, you shouldn't appear on XYZ's panel because he or she is a right winger or this or that. I think that's just nonsense. I think you find your friends where you can get them, and you work towards common cause. If it meets with your principles and your goals and your standards, then I'll take friends wherever I can find them.
I also think that the alliances of individuals that sit on corporate boards, where, especially let's say in the ISPs, where they have tremendous influence, are important. This is, I know I always sound like the crass marketing person, but this is a celebrity-driven culture, and having voices that can align with public knowledge on not every issue, but on certain issues, and leveraging those voices is a smart thing to do.
No permanent friends, no permanent enemies. That was
Right. No entangling alliances of the George Washington kind of, yeah.
Well, I'll note for
Yeah.
folks, Gigi referenced working with I think it was the Christian Coalition. If you subscribe to Public Knowledge's YouTube channel, you can see some of these old videos from 10, 13 years ago with Public Knowledge standing next to Christian Coalition fighting for openness online. So check those out and please subscribe. One more here. It looks like it's coming from one of our former policy fellows. Of course, after Gigi transitioned out, our second president and CEO created a fellowship and training program. And this person asked, what are some of the timeless skills and strategies that were true back at the founding and true now about leveraging that should be leveraged to affect change in the coming years?
You guys want to take that?
Yeah, anyone?
I mean, again, at the risk of repeating myself, I think communication, and repeating Laurie, I just think the ability to communicate an idea simply and to promote it through frankly, you have a lot more channels now to promote Public Knowledge's message than you had when I was there, right? So I just think comms is so, I know people think sometimes it's fluff, but I actually think that's the way that's the way you change public opinion. It's the way you change policymakers' opinion. I think your next webinar is going to be about SOPA PIPA. Talk about an issue where we were getting slammed, just slammed. And it was a combination of coalition building, and Ernie was really at the forefront of it. I don't think he got as much credit as he deserved. On Strange Bedfellows, there were definitely a left-right continuum in that coalition, without a doubt. I actually was on sabbatical when most of that happened, so it really was him. It's the comms, and frankly, let's not put this past. It's expertise. Like, how many times has Public Knowledge testified? Right? If you were a dummy and didn't know what the heck you were talking about, you wouldn't be asked to testify over and over and over again, right? So you do have to have that deep substantive knowledge that's critically important. So I just think it's a combination, at least, of those three things that really, you want to talk about secret sauce, I think are lessons that everyone should take.
The other thing is just, I'm sorry, just as an activity is this whole idea of narrative, right? Of how public knowledge tells its story per any initiative that it wants to promote, and actually, deconstructing very, very complex inside the Beltway policy issues is really, really important for me. But the other thing is that because this is about the public, be to start to engage the public in that narrative, right? In other words, a series of challenges where this is the story we need to get out. How are we going to get that out? And that becomes, I don't mean it to sound like a contest, but it becomes a way to build the network of the public in public knowledge and make it a challenge for some young people. They could be TikTok videos. It doesn't matter, right? It just is a way to tell the story, but to have the public telling the story in addition to the experts in Washington telling the story.
You triggered me.
Can I just say one?
I said that's enough, David.
David, real quick, and then Gigi, and then
Well,
we
I
got
was
to wrap.
going to say, you triggered me that so much of what public knowledge has done has been crystallizing and articulating what is the issue, because issues don't just arrive on your doorstep. They evolve, they are created, and public knowledge has helped interpret and create what those issues are and how they get framed.
I just want to tell one little factoid because Angela Seifer wants more stories.
Yes.
So our name was
remember that?
Our name was created by Leslie Harris,
yeah.
Who was the head of CDT, was actually a People for the American Way when I was working for Andy Schwartzman. We were subtenants there, and is one of the top privacy experts in the country, because I think we were struggling for a name, and she just popped it out. So, and then the logo was made by a friend of Laurie's. We had this unfortunate guy who used to design wine bottles, and he kept making these logos for us, and they were terrible.
All right.
This friend of Laurie just like popped it out.
I loved it. I always loved that logo.
The logo, PK myth or PK fact, the logo represents the public square, or is it just a logo that was made up?
You tell me.
That's such a great question. I don't know.
No one knows inside the organization, really. It's an open question.
I used to know, but I don't know anymore.
I don't know anyway. But there was some philosophy that was driving the content. I mean, that was building blocks. It was this idea of a nucleus of something. It was, things happening around it. But yeah, debated for a long time.
We had much better swag when I was there. I tried to. You guys got to up your swag game.
Okay. This is good advice. Yeah, I will take all the advice I can from you guys. You guys have been through the wars. We got to wrap it up here. I really appreciate you guys spending time with us today. And, I hope folks will, again, subscribe to our YouTube channel, but also really follow this series that we're just starting here. We are, as Gigi said, we're going to, probably in about a month or so, do the next session on one of the great fights that public knowledge led on, the Sopa Pippa fight. There it is on your screen. I hope you can see it. There's our 20th anniversary logo, a modification of the original logo that we're still keeping. We're not getting rid of it, Gigi, I promise.
Better not.
Yeah, but we hope folks will follow the series, tune in, certainly follow us online. And I just want to thank Laurie and David and Gigi for building this institution and helping to keep these stories out here so people understand why we do what we do. It's incredibly important for the next generation. So thank you guys for being here.
Congratulations, Chris, and congratulations to Public Knowledge, and happy 20th anniversary.
Yeah, we're so proud of you guys.
Yeah, really, you're doing such a great job.
Thank you guys.
Absolutely.
And we'll see you all at the next one.
You bet.
Excellent.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.